I sometimes go through these periods of depression. Feeling sorry for myself is probably a more accurate description. But I remind myself that my life is really not that bad, and things could be worse. I was reading a Dennis the Menace cartoon a few weeks ago. Dennis is out shopping, and the salesperson has these mugs that say, "Greatest mom in the world." And Dennis says, "Shouldn't you only sell one of those?" And in line with that, the engineer in me says there's like 6 billion people in the world, and there's only one person that has the worst life. So there's billions of people out there that have a worse life than me. I keep this file of stories in my mind about people who've been through difficult times. And some are personal, some are things that I've read, and I thought I'd share one of those stories this morning. John was a kid that grew up in my neighborhood, and John was one of the nicest and still is too, one of the most generous and friendly people I've ever met. And he was one of the really, really good friends that I met young and grew up with. We went to school together, played sports together, got in trouble a little bit together. And when we got into high school, John dropped out of high school, and we kind of drifted apart, but I kept in touch with his family, especially his mom. And I was headed for college, and in 1976, just before I started college, John got a job at the Ford plant out in Clay Como. And that was a great job for a kid that's 19 years old and doesn't have any kind of high school education. Unfortunately, there's a lot of temptation, youthful indiscretions that go along with a good job and money to burn. John met this lady, and I always thought it was a little more about sex and good looks than it was about intelligence and character. Against my good advice, John ended up marrying her, and they drifted into drugs and heavy drinking, things like that. Well, I went off to college and started my own life and didn't hear a lot about John and his wife for a number of years. And then in the spring of 1985, I got a call from John's mom one afternoon, and she was all excited, actually upset, and wanted to know if I knew a good lawyer because John had been arrested for murder. And I won't go into all the details, but John was working night shift at the Ford plant, and he suspected his wife was messing around, so he skipped work and he caught his wife with some other man. Again, I won't go into the details, but the guy ended up dead. And one of my initial reactions was, why didn't you shoot your wife? But who am I to judge? John ended up getting convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to a maximum of 30 years in prison. John initially went to maximum security prison in Jefferson City, and a few years later they moved him to Moberly, a medium security prison just north of Columbia. Just shortly after he got to Moberly, he got one of his jailhouse buddies to file for divorce from his wife. He didn't need to do the paperwork because his wife was living with some guy and they got in a fight, and she ended up dead. The guy got convicted of murder, and guess what prison they sent the guy to Moberly. John's mom told me the prison officials actually wanted him to sign a release form that made the prison not responsible if anything happened, because I guess the inmates and these kind of things promote all kinds of different deals. In 1996, John's mother passed away, I went to the funeral and I wondered what would happen. And the prison actually let him go. He came to the funeral with 2 guards, and he was in an orange prison jumpsuit, shackles on his hands and his feet. And, they let him walk up to the casket, and then they took him away. They wouldn't let him stay. I guess they were worried about some of his relatives breaking him out in the funeral or something. But he went back to prison, and shortly after his mom passed away, he got his GED, and he was scheduled to get out of prison in the summer of 1999. As most of you know, I spent a number of years in Thailand, and I was actually there for 2 periods of time. Initially, I went in early 1996, and I came back in late 1998. One of the reasons that I came back was to help John, because he was getting out of prison, and John happens to be my brother. Karen touched on this a little bit a few meetings ago about Toby Young, and it's extremely difficult for somebody to come out of prison and get back into society. So there's deals with getting a job, with having a place to live, transportation, insurance, on and on. And obviously John needed some help. That's why a lot of people end up going back to prison. So I wanted to obviously help my brother get reoriented back into society. And it's also important to have friends and relative support. So John lived with my wife and I and my young daughter, and a friend of mine gave him a job, and he worked at a warehouse driving a truck. We got him a loan for a small pickup truck. He paid it off, got some credit rating, and eventually actually got hired on back out at Ford. So less than a year after he got out of prison, my wife and I returned to Thailand. He got married. I have a young niece named Julianne, and things worked out pretty well, actually. It's been a long time since I did a personal speech in front of this group, and you could clock me out as disqualified. But it's been a long time since I did a personal speech in front of this group, and this is not a story that I share very often. But I wanted to get out of my comfort zone and share a story. Besides, this is a lot cheaper than going to a psychiatrist. And you guys are a lot more fun than a therapy group. And I appreciate you listening. Mr.